Hey there, it's time for the show, the Tatiana Show, where you make friends and talk life and crypto. This episode of The Tatiana Show has been brought to you by eToro.com. You can trade in a wide range of assets, connect with the crypto community, and automatically copy top-performing portfolios at eToro.com. Quite simply, they have the top currencies, smart tools, low fees, social trading, all in one simple app. Connect with over 11 million eToro traders around the world using social feeds. eToro makes powerful trading tools easy. Get started in minutes right now at eToro.com. That's eToro.com. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tatiana Show. Today, we're talking about your health. And we're actually talking about your health specifically if you live in the UK. I was at Bitbrum in November, which is in Birmingham. It was a British conference. And I noticed people loving the NHS. And I was shocked because this is very Austrian economics to love this kind of socialized healthcare. And, you know, we've all been warned, but the people seem to like it. Then, however, I came upon Dr. Victoria Jones. She's a dentist. I don't know if you call her a doctor. There's a DR before it, but apparently it's not the same thing. We're going to learn about a couple, I guess, medical terms. But aside from that, Victoria and I were talking, and she actually is outside of the NHS medical system as a dentist, and she started giving me some reasons why. So I wanted to explore this a little bit. But before we say hi to her, I just wanted to say hi to my dear and darling co-host, Josh Shagala, who hasn't been with us, but he's here with us today. So, hey, Josh, how are you?
Hey, Tatiana. It's great to be back on the show.
Happy to have you back, of course.
Yeah. I'm actually in the UK at the moment for Brexit.
What does that mean? You're there to experience the Brexiting?
Oh, I'm experiencing the Brexiting all the way. No, I'm here from Berlin in the UK because the company's UK, Berlin based. So, yeah, it's just interesting to see what happens. And when I try to get back to the EU, how that will work out, I don't know. Let's see. I brought my Irish passport as well, so hopefully that'll work.
Okay. Well, I didn't know that you had to go there, but I'm glad that you're spending a little bit of time in merry old England. Perhaps you can say hi to Victoria. Victoria, thank you so much for being on the Tatiana Show today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Okay, so tell me, dentists and doctors, how does it work? Why do you have a doctor in front of a dentist name if you can't be called a doctor?
Well, typically the doctor title is normally given to people who have PhDs. Now, medical doctors don't have PhDs and neither do dentists. But it's a courtesy title. And actually in the medical profession, once you become a surgeon, you drop the doctor title and you become a mister. So it's like a historical thing. So it's a norm, once you are qualified as a medical professional, you're given the title doctor. And then as you progress through the levels, you eventually become mister. So for a long time, the dentists actually didn't want to call themselves doctor because they felt it was demotion because they felt, as they're actually performing surgery on patients in real life in the dental surgery, for a long time they didn't want to use the title doctor, but have gradually over time, especially when women became more into the profession, it was a good way of distinguishing which ones were the dentists in a practice rather than the dentist and the hygienist. And so it was 1997, actually, the year I graduated, that the General Dental Council, who manages the licenses for dentists in the UK, agreed that dentists could now use the doctor as a courtesy title. So,
that's fascinating. I thought Mr. was just by default, like anyone could be a Mr.
They are, but in the medical profession, it's just the way the hierarchy used to work. So you'd be a doctor in the hospitals, you'd be a doctor, but once you became a consultant or a surgeon, you'd often revert back to the title Mr.
We're getting a little history lesson. I like it. Thank you. So for people who are not familiar with you and your work in the crypto space, maybe you could give me a little bit of background about how you got into medicine and then how you made the crossover into Bitcoin before we start delving into the benefits and the minuses of a socialized medical system, pluses and minuses, I guess.
Wow. Okay. So that's a big topic. So, when I was younger, obviously, like most people, you're choosing, which career you want to go into. And I liked the idea of doing a job that was very practical. I was also good at the sciences. I also wanted a profession where I'd be fairly independent and well respected, and have a good income. at the time, when I was looking into that, a lot of the medical doctors in the newspapers, they were reporting how a lot of the young doctors were having to work these really long hours and losing a lot of sleep. And I didn't like that idea. So for various reasons, I chose dentistry instead. I thought it would be, quite a glamorous thing to do, fixing people's teeth, making them look nicer again. So I did. I went to dental school and studied for 5 years, and then had to do vocational training for another year. And of course, I learned how to do all these amazing things at university. But of course, the moment you graduate, the first place you have to work when you graduate is in the NHS. And so for a long time, for about 30 or 40 years, the NHS had a really strong presence in the UK. But I think in 1992, the government decided to cut the fees for dentists. And so at that point in time, some of the dentists started to move away from the NHS system into the private sector because they felt that cut in the fees was compromising the work that they were able to offer to their patients. And so, I graduated, and of course, a lot of the dentists were still struggling with, how to keep providing the same level of care they were able to for their patients, but, having less income coming into their practices. And so, the younger dentists by default had to work in the NHS system. And, I was suddenly confronted with the fact that, I'd learned how to do all these amazing things at university, but then working within the NHS system, there were a number of things that I couldn't do, or my choices were constrained in terms of what I could do, because there was a conflict between, what would help to pay the bills of the practice and was most economical compared to, what would be ideal in a clinical situation. So, and I found that very fascinating. I was very interested in how, the economics of the system and the way in which the system was set up was then compromising what I felt I could offer for my patients. So right from the get-go, right at the beginning, I was interested in that. And even as a dental student, I won the 4th year prosthetic prize for writing an essay called "A Partial Denture is a Poor Man's Bridge." So this issue of economics and healthcare has kind of been a constant theme that I find very interesting. So that was the situation when I first became a dentist. And then, because I was curious about this problem between NHS and private healthcare, eventually I went off and studied for an MBA, because my dad had an MBA and my sister had a business degree, and it seemed quite interesting. And this issue of economics, I mean, when I became a dentist, there was still very much a historical precedent of this kind of professionalism. The professionals, it's almost like money was a dirty word. We don't talk about that. We're just interested in, doing the best that we can, for our patients, and we don't have to think about that. And so a lot of dentists, I was aware, especially some of the older generation, found that a real struggle to kind of get their heads around. And of course, all of the changes, I think they found very, very stressful, because it was very different to what they'd been used to. And so during my career, I've seen a number of things change very rapidly from the day I graduated. And of course, now that I understand more about Bitcoin, I understand it much more from an economic perspective, especially having done a business degree as well and having studied economics. I can see how the way in which the financial system was set up has kind of led to a number of these problems. And the thing is, it's quite subtle. So it's quite a difficult thing to explain to people just in 5 minutes. There are so many elements to it. It's like, it took me 20 years to kind of figure out, it took me 10 years to kind of figure out how I felt regarding NHS and private dental care. And then of course I started my own business so that I could work purely in the private sector. And of course I started my business when just as the financial crisis was kicking off. And even though I'd done a business degree by then, I hadn't fully appreciated the larger financial system and the effect that would have. So what that meant was I was starting this very expensive business literally at the worst time in history, which had a significant effect. And of course, that made me delve deeper into what was going on in the financial system, and eventually taught me about sound money. And then, once I understood about sound money and I thought about the practicalities of that, I thought, realistically, as a business, I was never going to be interested in accepting gold and silver coins. So what was the digital solution? And of course, that led me to Bitcoin. And I went through the process. I started to offer patients the ability to pay in Bitcoin in my practice, and learned more and more about it. And I mean,
I love
I'm not
it.
sure
I love it.
how much detail you want me to go into, because it is a long story. I've decided to write a book about it because, if I spend time with friends and I get onto this topic, I could easily spend about 3 hours telling them about the ins and outs of it. So instead of wasting my time repeating the same story to my friends, I was like, tell you what, if I write you a book, and then I can, if you're interested, you can read this. It'll tell you everything that you need to know. And then I don't have to repeat the story so many times. But, what I've just told you is, pretty much the basic elements of it. And so if there's anything you'd like to explore to follow on with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
I wanted to bring it back a bit for those that don't know what the NHS is, because a lot of countries have different systems. Well, every country has a slightly different system, but they're all based on either a true private system or a public system, and then sometimes slightly in between. So it'd be interesting to find out exactly what the system is in Britain before we move on. Like if I've got cancer, let's say, what happens
in the UK?
Yeah.
So in the UK, the medical system is slightly different to the dental system. So the NHS was actually started in the UK in the 1940s, and initially, and so the idea was, I think it was, I won't give you the name in case I get it wrong, but basically they had this idea that they wanted to create a healthcare system free at the point of demand. It was part of the reward for the veterans after World War II. I think it was a big debate at the time because, of course, the heroes had come home from the war, and they'd been promised a better lifestyle as a result of fighting in the war. So there's a big political debate at the time, and they made healthcare free at the point of demand, medical healthcare, but the dentists were much more picky about it, and it took a long time for them to actually persuade the dentists to join the healthcare system as well. And so what that meant was there was actually a difference between the healthcare that was given for medical problems and the healthcare that was given for dental problems and also eye problems as well, because a lot of dental clinics, like now, they kind of operate as independent practitioners, and I think they could anticipate the problems with it, and so they were very resistant to signing up for it. But eventually what happened is, the government paid so much money to the people who agreed to sign up to the system that eventually it made it very, the others just couldn't compete. So that was what enabled everybody to kind of end up, it effectively created a monopoly, because everyone had to jump on board because no one else could afford to compete with it. So with dentistry, it was set up in such a way that people would pay for an item of treatment as they needed it, and the government would reimburse that. But with medical healthcare, it was different. They funded it by buying hospitals and GP practices, and the medical staff were salaried, whereas with the dental staff, they were paid based on how productive they were. So going back to your original question, in the UK, if someone has cancer, they'll end up in the medical system. They'll go to their GP. Their visit to the GP will be free. Anything that they need in relation to that treatment is free. I think if they have drugs that they need, everyone gets a prescription, but there's a standard price regarding whichever medicine that they require. There's a fee to pay, but the fee doesn't vary depending on the drug that you get. Everyone gets the same drug. There's just a standard fee as a contribution for that drug. And so the costs in healthcare are very standardized to such an extent that most people in this country have absolutely no clue what the real cost of medical healthcare is. And actually, if you start telling them how much a similar thing costs in another country where they only have private healthcare, a lot of them are actually usually very shocked.
Yeah, can you give us an example of that?
Of costs in healthcare.
Just of like what would something cost in a private system if you have just a comparison, apples to oranges, or I don't know if it would be apples to apples, I suppose.
Well, I suppose the one that I can relate to for myself. So even as a as a private dentist, because we're constantly still having to cope with the NHS, even though we can offer private healthcare, generally speaking, we have to keep our fees within a certain limit. Otherwise, you'd never get any customers. So an example of mine is, I think a patient went over to America for a holiday, and while he was over there, one of his front teeth came off, a post crown, and so he needed to have an emergency root canal treatment and an emergency post crown, and he ended up with a bill for about $5,000, which fortunately he had insurance cover for. But when he came back to me, we were all incredulous, because I was like, even me, top dollar, everything included that he'd had done would have been $1,000, and on the NHS that would have just been a couple of £100, and that's just in dental healthcare. Obviously, with medical healthcare, it's very different. I'm not sure exactly what they would charge for things in America, but I mean, I think I've heard that it costs 10 grand or something to have a baby in a hospital in America, whereas you wouldn't be charged anything at all to have that in the UK.
Right. So, I mean, that makes it seem almost better. It's not exactly making the case for it, right? If I'm a poor person and, they're taking it out of my taxes anyway, I usually don't notice it on that end. And then if I get cancer, then I don't have to pay anything. That seems like a pretty good deal. I mean, I'm not really a fan of this.
It's true.
It seems like what normal people would logically come up with. So where do the problems come in?
Well, can I just jump in there? Because it reminds me of, imagine if the government made horse and cart free for everybody. Would Henry Ford's car ever have taken off? Would anyone have ever driven this smelly thing that you have to refill? And no. So what happens is when you have free, which sounds great and it's fantastic, and there are many virtues of having free. Oh my God. I mean, I had heart surgery for free in Australia, which is very similar to the NHS, and I couldn't be happier. But I think that's where you start to see economical issues in terms of competition creating new, better ways of doing things get stifled.
Yeah, so I mean, you both make excellent points. I mean, going to Tatiana's first, I mean, and this is the problem, it makes the NHS a real political hot potato, because of course it's amazing. I mean, I have seen videos of people on the street being told, how much healthcare, British people on the street being told how much healthcare costs in other countries, and they can't get over it. They just don't understand it. But because of that, they've been spoilt, and they've been spoilt for so long. People who've never experienced that difference, because not everyone gets to go on holiday abroad. So people who've never experienced that difference, it just boggles their mind. They assume that everywhere in the world is just like here, and it's not, and they're completely divorced from reality. From it, and so this is why the British throw up their hands in horror any kind of suggestion that Trump might be making a deal with the UK post Brexit, because it might compromise their precious NHS, and so it does. It creates real problems, because people are used to these free goodies, but and of course they can only really understand it from their perspective. They can only really understand it from the perspective of them going to the doctor or them going to the dentist. And generally speaking, if you're relatively healthy, you don't really need to access those services very much. But, if you're constantly bombarded on the TV of these stories of, this little girl that needed heart surgery and, how the NHS saved her life, there's a lot of propaganda that kind of keeps the myth going. And so, from the public's perspective, I totally get why they worship it so much. I think the difference from my perspective is because I come at it from a professional angle, because especially when I graduated, I was there at that key point where, the quality of service was really starting to be compromised, because, government was cutting back funding, and because of the way in which it limited the choices of the professionals, which ultimately limits the outcomes for them long term. I think being able to see it from a professional perspective, you get a longer view. You can see the effects, because you can see the effects in the older people of decisions that could have been made when they were younger that they didn't make. And because it takes, this is the problem with healthcare, health problem, you've got acute illnesses where things happen quickly, but then you've got chronic illnesses that build up over a long period of time. And, and the effects can be very subtle. It's like, for a number of decades, smoking was fine until suddenly you get this whole group of people who are getting cancer because you suddenly realize that actually they shouldn't have been smoking all of those years. And so, it takes a long time for the effects of lifestyle to have an effect on illness. And of course, the problem is if you live in an environment where it doesn't matter if you make a mistake with your health, because supposedly there's an organization there that will fix it if anything goes wrong, to a certain extent, it starts to take away that personal responsibility. It starts to take away the motivation for people to care for themselves. Now, I know that's not true across the board. I know there are some people who will take care of themselves regardless. But of course, as a healthcare professional, you see a whole range of the population. And trust me, there is a section of I've had people come in and go, oh, well, the fact that my teeth are a problem, it's your fault because you're my dentist. It's like, what? What planet are you living on? So, there is this tendency for people to delegate their responsibility to other people, which actually is fundamentally unhealthy. And, there are all sorts of storylines we could explore along this tangent, because if people are really willing to give up their self-sovereignty to someone else, and people will do it very willingly if they believe that entity will look after them, there are people who are very willing to do that if they feel that they are being looked after in return. But to a certain extent, because there's inadequate knowledge there, they can feel they're being looked after, but in reality they're not. Because sorry, I'll let you ask a question.
I know, I was just I wanted to take it back a bit to why certain countries are so expensive, because a lot of people say, oh, well, if it's private, then it's super expensive. And that's also just not true. We see in certain parts of Asia where medical was very unregulated, and it was in the beginning quite terrible, but it was cheap. And people would go there for beauty treatments and cosmetic surgeries. And that got so popular that then more and more surgeries started opening up for bigger and bigger and proper surgeries. I mean, when I say proper, I mean, things to cure people of certain illnesses and stuff like that. And as this gets more and more popular, more competition, different surgeries competing each other, these prices get held down. The problem that you have in places like America is that the doctors' unions and lobbies get so big that they pressure government to basically pass certain regulations where you're not allowed to become a doctor, you're not allowed to do night school. You have to study full-time. And so that automatically cuts out anyone that's slightly poor because they have to work at the same time to cover their expenses or whatever. It's fundamentally flawed in terms of that sense, but it's also like, oh no, you can't just have a nurse swab the tongue and put it in a petri dish and send it off for testing. You have to have a doctor doing it. And so there's all these sort of ridiculous overheads that are causing a massive amount of pressure on the few resources that are then constrained by the state to say, no, we're not, by putting all these barriers of entry in, that costs automatically go up, which is great for the doctors that are left. Now, this is one side of the argument for, hey, we need to sort of loosen up with certain regulations on who can become doctors, how you can go through the medical educational system to become someone that can help other people. Is this, how does that ring true in the UK?
Well, again, I mean, you make some excellent points. And I have to say, I don't think there's a country on the planet that's really solved the problem of healthcare, because it is such an emotive issue. I mean, you're talking about people who are dying and suffering. And of course, that really draws on people's emotions. I think the issue with America is that although they maintain it's a free market, it's not. They have private healthcare, but it's not a free market because they might not have an NHS. The NHS is a government-controlled monopoly. I would say in America, you've got insurance-based monopolies. And of course, the problem with monopolies is that, you do start getting this lobbying effect, and you start to get groupthink at the top of the organizations, the people at the top of the organizations who believe they know best, even if there might be people further down the chain who, have their own ideas. And even some of the individual practitioners can be quite creative in how they manage the patients. But of course, the moment something goes wrong, there's an outcry, and then the public are clamoring for regulation in order to make sure something like that never happens again. And so, but of course, the problem is with healthcare, I mean, you know, it's natural for us to die eventually. And it's not like you can have a completely pain-free life. There are going to be times when, you know, things do happen that are unpleasant, and you can't always avoid them. And so punishing the healthcare professions or the healthcare organizations when something goes wrong inappropriately, you know, it creates all sorts of perverse incentives within the system, which create a real problem. So, you know, economics is one side of it. You know, these monopolies that have been created, you know, if you study economics, you understand the effect of that, because, you know, with the NHS, if by suppressing the prices, they've distorted the supply and demand curve, which is often what happens in monopolies. So what happens is, by suppressing the prices, you massively increase demand. You know, all the people who didn't have access to dental treatment before the NHS came along, then the NHS came along and made it available to a wider group of people. I mean, the dentists had never been so busy before the NHS was invented. And so what happens is you create this monster, this behemoth that, you know, is just unstoppable. And this has been happening for almost, I mean, just in the UK, this has been happening for almost 100 years now. And so you've got this organization that just gets bigger and bigger and more expensive. And because there are no natural limits within the system itself, you know, there's nothing to stop it, and everybody worships it, and it just gets bigger. Whereas in, you know, America, it's different. You know, everyone's been conditioned to pay for it, but you've got a different kind of monopoly through the insurance companies. You might not just have one monopoly, you might have 2 or 3 big ones, but the effects are the same. And because they are these large organizations, it gives them a lot of power. And of course, you know, whenever anything goes wrong, if there's an outcry, it's an excuse to make a new law. And so you just kind of, you know, you create this monster that's just really, really difficult to control, because for some reason, as human beings, we've got to this stage in our development where we think that every single problem can be cured. And if someone can't fix it, then someone else ought not to be blamed. And you've also got the legal system comes into this. You know, if something goes wrong, you know, who's to blame? Where do you get compensation? How is that compensation funded? Often, if it's funded through the indemnity organizations, that's in turn funded by the individual professionals having to fund their insurance policies. And so the more dysfunctional the system gets, the more expensive it gets, because, you know, the individual professionals, in order to cover their insurance costs, then have to raise the prices for their patients in order to sustain their businesses. And so you kind of get this feedback loop that just kind of compounds the problem and makes it bigger and bigger. Does that help to understand?
Yeah, that's some really, really good insight. And those are some great insights. What's the point of all this technology without a little love in our lives? Our hosts, Tatiana Moroz, Dr. Stephanie Murphy, and Lauren Kasovitz, have come together to bring you Proof of Love. Go to proofoflovecast.com. I have a question regarding the pricing. In the United States, I guess they just passed a law that the hospitals have to put their prices on the hospital. That, to me, as a consumer that has been outside of the health insurance system at different times, I think that's great, because at least I can budget. Can I afford this expensive thing? What do you think about that? Have you guys had to list prices, and have you seen any negative or positive effects from that?
So in the hospitals, no, they don't have any prices at all, because, you know, none of the patients have to pay it. In dentistry, you do. So, and again, because I graduated just as they were starting to introduce private healthcare, you know, we did go through a phase where there were some dentists for whom it was like, well, price is a dirty word. I don't want to have to discuss this with my patients. And they actually had to bring in a rule to say that you had to display your prices, and people had to have written treatment plans. And so, you know, they did have to regulate quite clearly that, you know, the dentists had to display their prices and their treatment costs, especially when they could go to a practice that was supposedly NHS and they were getting a combination of NHS treatments and private treatments. So yeah, they did go through a phase where they had to be really clear on that. But the professionals were very resistant to it, because, You know, I mean, just being a medical professional is quite complicated. And most medical professionals, you know, they don't get any business training in their undergraduate career. And so it's quite, you know, it's quite stressful figuring out how to handle it. I mean, some people, if they've grown up in a family where they've run their own business, then, you know, maybe they find it a little bit easier to handle. But, you know, and especially in a Christian country as well, it's almost like, you know, money's a dirty word and poverty is a virtue. You know, it makes it even more difficult. But the thing is, the reality is, unless you have the confidence to ask for the money you need from the people you're providing the service for, that service will fall apart, because, you know, things like medical and dental services are very, very expensive businesses to provide. And so, you know, running a dental or medical business, you know, keeping everything balanced can be a really, really tricky thing to do. And so anyone who's kind of handicapped in their ability to kind of say, this is a procedure, can you pay this much, please? You know, it's a real struggle. And so especially, well, in the UK, I think it's more of a problem because there's this culture of not having to pay for medical treatment at all. I imagine in different countries, there are medical professionals who've got used to that and so are much more comfortable with it. But again, you know, that's something that can be exploited as well, especially, you know, like in America with the insurance companies. So, but obviously I don't work there, so I'm more familiar with what happens in the UK.
Do you guys have brain drain because there's a limit to what doctors can make there? I mean, do people think, okay, I'm going to go practice in a different country, or not so much because people do have the private insurance options there?
To a certain extent, although I have to say the medical professionals are paid very well. I mean, at the moment, there's a big hoo-ha in this country because I think a while ago, the government put a limit on how much you could have in your pension fund before you were paying a much higher rate of tax. And so a lot of the senior doctors have stopped working because their pension funds have already reached that limit. And so basically by working extra hours, they weren't getting any benefit because they'd have this extra tax on their pension funds. And so recently they've had to make a rule to say that it doesn't apply to the doctors, because in order to keep feeding, you know, the demand, that's required if the doctors all are suddenly cutting their hours because it's not worth working the extra hours anymore, then obviously the whole system starts to fall apart. So they've just had to make that extra rule. So the answer to your question is, you know, the doctors actually do pretty well and have quite a nice lifestyle because it's really nice to be shielded from a lot of these business issues. And of course, they can argue for what they want as a group. For the dentists, I think it is harder because they are having to run their own individual and individual businesses. And yeah, there's definitely a brain drain. I know of a lot of British dentists who are now settled in Australia, not just because it's more financially rewarding over there, but also because of the restrictions in terms of how they can practice and the treatments that they can deliver. It's just so frustrating and soul destroying to work in a system where, you know, you're just fighting fires all day. You're not really solving any problems. You just, you know, you're kind of catching people, you know, when they've kind of got a real problem rather than earlier when they can really make sure that they don't get any problems in the first place. So, and I've heard of young dentists now going out to Asia. So I think they are. But also on the other flip side of that is we have a lot of European dentists over here because of the EU. Because the thing is, you know, I think it was 2010, they wanted, or maybe a bit earlier than that, they wanted to introduce a change to the dentist contract yet again. And actually the dentists really started to protest and said, we really don't want to sign up for this. We're not going to sign up for this contract. And there was an MP called Rosie Winterton who said, that's fine, we'll just go and recruit all of these dentists in Europe. And so we got a wave of dentists coming in from Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, where, you know, things like private healthcare aren't so well funded because they were desperate for these NHS jobs that would give them a secure income. So it's a real balance. And, you know, even for myself, you know, once I was running a private practice, I was probably charging my patients 10 times as much, but my colleagues working in the NHS were earning more than I was, much more than I was. And so, you know, people find it really hard to get their head around that because that's directly related to how expensive it is to run your business. So in my particular example, you know, there'll be a rule that says you have to do medical emergency training once a year. If you do it in the NHS, they'll provide that training for free. If I wanted to go to the same organisation, if I didn't have an NHS contract, they wanted to charge me £1,000 for that. So, that's just one example. And it's all of those costs behind the scenes that, I'm only able to fund from the fees I pay my patients. Whereas, although the NHS dentists are collecting some fees, they're also getting subsidies behind the scenes that help to support their businesses. And so, even though there are people who will kind of want to work in want to create an environment of free market to give people choices, it's actually a really, really difficult thing to do when you're competing against a monopoly, essentially. So with a very, very strong brand, which was what the NHS is.
I have a couple questions about that. So what happens to the EU dentists when there's a Brexit? Do they have to leave or what would happen?
Well, yeah, there's been a big hoo-ha about that. So no, I think the way it's going to work at the moment is anyone who's already settled here will be automatically given citizenship. But what it will mean is that in the future, any European dentists that want to come in, they will be restricted. And of course, there are some dentists in the UK who run large, big scale practices, and they rely on a lot of these European dentists as, for their staff. And so it's going to have a huge effect on some of these larger organizations to not have that ready supply of dentists anymore. And hopefully, it'll make it a lot more competitive and maybe hopefully a little bit easier for the dentists over here as well, because it was a real kick in the teeth when, that minister went, okay, you don't want to sign a contract, we'll get all the European dentists to come over. And it's just like, where do you go from there? If sounding your voice and your ability to protest is to go, we don't like that, so we're not going to sign your contract, then, well, fine, we'll just get someone else from over here to come and do that instead. Especially when you're fighting for something that's really important. It's not just about the funding, but it's being able to sustain the quality in order to give people what they need. Tricky dilemma.
Do other dentists share the same frustrations as you? Because I think that anybody who has a decent amount of business sense, which as you discussed, they maybe don't have training in, but they're sort of forced into. Are they, what's the feeling among other dentists? Do they share similar frustrations, and how is that being resolved? Is there any kind of, like education or what do they do about it?
Well, it's really difficult. And actually I was amazed, especially in the earlier days of my career. You'll go to local dental meetings in the UK and all they want to talk about is, how to fight the government for the latest funding that they need. Because of course, in order to get what they need, they have to kind of collectively ask for it. And so that was commonly the biggest focus of a lot of local dental meetings I went to. Now, many occasions, I went over to America for some dental conferences, and there it was completely different. The focus was like, we change people's lives, and this is what we can do, and this is the latest new technique. And I was really struck by the contrast of that, just the difference in the culture and the difference in the focus. So America, it was all about, these are the amazing things that we can do for our patients. In England, it was all about how do we get the government to give us more money for this? And really, really depressing. And so they understand it's a problem, but they think the only way of solving it is to ask the government for more money. And again, I think it's a problem that comes from not understanding the economics behind it. And for 20 years, I didn't. I could see it was a problem in terms of the service I was able to provide for my patients. And on the face of it, you'd think the answer would be more money. But of course, the problem is bigger and more complex than that. And in terms of education, oh my God, where do I start? It's like the blind leading the blind. Now that I know what I know, and especially because I've always been interested in furthering my education, not just economically, but clinically as well. I've been to some of these courses and I've learned how to do different things. And I was at a course just a couple of days ago, and this dentist was poo-pooing some of the new methods I'd learned elsewhere in order to justify, what they were already doing. So people find it really hard to change and learn, even with new information. And even in healthcare, this is quite a well-known phenomenon, because with patients, it's well recognized that you can't just give them the information that they need and expect them to change. There are so many more elements to changing behavior than just giving people knowledge. They need other motivations in order to make that change. And actually, it's a really tricky thing to do, because human beings inherently are kind of creatures of habit. They, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the base layer is the physiological needs, but the second layer is safety. And so people they like what's familiar because it helps them to feel safe. And so, asking them to do anything that radically changes what they already do, they find very stressful. And that's not just for our patients, but it's also for the professionals as well. And things are changing so fast. I think, a lot of them really, really struggle to keep up. So the answer to your original question is, yes, from time to time, but generally speaking, the dentists have to go out and find the information themselves. And often they're expected to learn so many other things regarding to just how the medical aspects are changing, asking them to start to take on board, how some of the business things are changing. I mean, there are some business organizations, some business consulting companies that have kind of popped up to help educate dentists. But again, unless you've got a big pool of clients who understand and want to change and are being shown in the right direction, it's, their success is fairly limited. You can probably get a larger audience for general topics, but when it's a very, very niche topic like that, trying to do it cost effectively can be tricky.
What about talking to students that are just training and sort of doing talks with them? Or is that something that they really wouldn't allow in the schools because it's questioning the value of going into the NHS's service?
Well, exactly. I mean, the thing is, if they're teaching them one way and someone else comes in and goes, actually, everything they've taught you here is completely wrong. I mean, it's like a Bitcoiner going and talking to a central bank. I mean, you're probably much more familiar with that reaction than a healthcare reaction, but it's a similar kind of thing. You've got institutionalized dysfunction across the board. And of course, this is what led me to Bitcoin, because, I'd already come to terms with the institutional dysfunction within healthcare. And then in the process of running my business and having to learn more about economics, I then came to understand the institutional dysfunction in our financial system. So although I could start an argument about the institutional dysfunction in healthcare, unless you sort out the institutional dysfunction in the financial system, you're just not going to get anywhere. I mean, it's like, I say to people, it's like, you start grabbing on a thread, and it's like unraveling a jumper. You start unraveling, and before you know it, you've kind of got this whole hand of what. It's like, where do I start in terms of pulling it back together? I mean, the core of the dysfunction is just so fundamental, because so much of what healthcare is doing is driven by what's happening in the financial system. If it wasn't for the fiat currency system and the fact that they were starting to fudge the numbers after the First and Second World War, they'd have never been able to afford, the NHS healthcare system.
Yeah.
So, so that
it's really fascinating, because I at this stage, I kind of want to seek answers, because, we can go on forever about the problems. And a lot of systems are very different. At the end of the day, what we need to do is pool the money of many to help the unfortunate few that need help. And this is what insurance is all about, right? Insurance pools the money of many to help the unfortunate few. And whether you force that through a taxation and through a sort of a national healthcare service like the NHS, where everybody goes in, or it's voluntary in an insurance point of view, where, well, you volunteer and you have competing systems that try to sort of get you into their pool. These are the different systems, yet there's obviously flaws in both, as we've seen. But of course, there's also the things I touched upon with lobbies and all sorts to constrain supply of new doctors, or to flush too much supply in, or whatever. So there's a whole bunch of different issues here. Which country do you see that you think is a good system or is close to something that you like? And if there's no such thing, what kind of system would you like to see?
Well, I mean, again, this is my thinking on all of these subjects, and then understanding the financial system is what led me to Bitcoin. Because, of course, with Bitcoin, you're talking about, fundamental, you're going back to the purest free market economics. And the trouble is, no country on the world has that right now. So if all of the healthcare systems in the world are being influenced by that dysfunction, I don't think it's not even possible for any system in the world right now to have the solution. On one level, they're all experimenting with buttons and levers to try and push things in the direction that they want, but at the end of the day, they're doing it on a foundation based on sand. The trouble with the fiat currency system that we have is it's created moral hazards. We can't make fair agreements with each other anymore because the numbers we're using in order to make our business agreements and our business relationships, if money is debt and that debt is growing exponentially, those numbers are changing all the time. And so in that situation, it's impossible to have fair transactions. So, to talk about anyone having it right at the moment, I don't, because, the whole world is just fraught with dysfunction, right from the beginning. And that's why I love Bitcoin, because it kind of takes it back to ground zero. If there's a limited supply of currency and everyone always knows what the value of that currency is, you can start making fair agreements based on a unit that is not going to change in and of itself. It might change in terms of value compared to fiat currency, but in and of itself, if you say you're purchasing something for someone for 0.1 Bitcoin, people know instantly what that 0.1 Bitcoin is, and the value of it only changes as more and more people are absorbed into the network. So, why I find it so exciting is I think as the financial system changes with a deflationary currency, the expenses of everything will start to go down. And because arrangements between people can be more honest, we can start to look at these systems again much more clearly. But at the moment, because all of these systems are built on a foundation based on sand, it's been a great experiment to kind of figure out what works in certain situations. But, all it's shown is things we kind of understood anyway. If you reduce the cost, you increase the demand, and nature has naturally limiting systems, and you're never going to be able to cure everything. It's this fundamental psychology that someone should be able to fix this problem that we need to get over, because so much of healthcare and dental healthcare is down to good prevention. But that's not the focus, because you get the most revenue when you treat someone or you provide an expensive drug. So, if you finally have a system where, everybody is motivated to take care of themselves because there are real consequences if they don't, automatically you're going to reduce the amount of healthcare problems. So you'd be dealing with a very different problem. So it's a very, it's kind of a chicken and egg question, really. I think a lot of healthcare problems are due to the fact that people just don't look after themselves well, and they don't look after themselves well because they can't afford to. Anything that they save for their pension is getting wiped out. They don't understand how economics works properly, so they don't know how to look after themselves financially. They rely on the governments, which are gradually becoming bankrupt. So all the things that they felt that they could rely on as they were getting older are rapidly going to be diminishing. And you have to feel really sorry for a lot of these people, because what do you do in that situation if you've handed over your power to the government and you believe that in your old age you're going to get your pension and you're going to be cared for by the hospital, but suddenly all of those systems that you've relied on are wiped out? What do you do then?
No, I think a lot of people are waking up to the fact that every system that that we're relying on is a Ponzi scheme in its literal meaning. The pension scheme is a Ponzi scheme. We need new people to be coming into the job to pay taxes, to pay for the pensions, to retire on. We need new people to pay for the NHS, new people born. And what we're seeing is that also there's just less people being born in terms of, in the West anyway. We are seeing, especially the millennials are just not having sex anymore. The statistics are extraordinarily outrageous. And so I think what we'll see is this Ponzi scheme coming to an end, because there's not enough new people coming in to feed the Ponzi at the end. So there will be an implosion. And I hate to to quote politicians, but I think it was Margaret Thatcher who said, the problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. And this really rings true in terms of the socialized healthcare system that I fear will just collapse in a horrific way eventually.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you. And actually, if Bitcoin hadn't been invented, God knows where it would go. I mean, I think the amazing thing about Bitcoin is it kind of creates this sponge that at least allows for some kind of transition. So, and that was why, I got interested in starting to introduce Bitcoin as a payment method in my business, because, obviously the sooner people understand this, and also because the fundamentals are so sound, because it's been programmed based on sound money, really this is the answer. This is the way in which we need to kind of start transacting again in order to create a more solid foundation. But of course, that is quite traumatic for the people who are kind of at the end of the old system, who don't get it or don't understand, or who have relied on the government. And of course, the demographics, as you've just said, just does not support the old system. But all of these people were duped into believing that it would for such a long time. And honestly, if Bitcoin hadn't been invented, we would be in serious trouble. Literally, I think whoever invented Satoshi Nakamoto was divinely inspired to invent that technology. I really do believe that.
Especially at that time, we were heading towards digitization of cash anyway. The governments were digitizing everything, which means it would build this extraordinary Big Brother-esque surveillance state around currency and around money, around payments, that the world's never seen. And with that network effect, it's extraordinarily hard to dislodge that sort of network effect. Whereas before that all happened, Satoshi came along and started, hey, you know what, digital cash here, it was already starting with PayPal and stuff, and obviously credit cards, but for a true internet native currency to come along at that time was just perfect timing to make sure that the network effect didn't go in the wrong direction. And so it's, I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah, completely inspired, and literally has saved humanity. And it sounds like a really strong statement, but once you understand all of the issues, it's like we were heading for a dystopian nightmare. And actually, we may still be if people don't understand this soon enough, which is why these podcasts are so important. And, I took a year, I've sold my business and taken time out of my career to really understand it, because I get how important it is. And I've now written this book in order to kind of really help explain to people this is how it affects you on a day-to-day life. And you can't put your head in the sand, because, the central banks are already talking about digital currencies and admitting that digital currencies are effectively money, but they won't admit that Bitcoin is. So, what's that setting us up for? If there is a point of crisis and they come along and go, excellent, we knew this was going to happen, here's our solution. It's just like, no. That's based on your way of doing up until now. And I'm sorry, but you've completely botched it. So, something like, Bitcoin is literally an opportunity for humanity to make a different choice. But unless they have the information and they understand how important it is that they make that choice, it might not happen. I mean, at the moment, obviously, Bitcoin's got, I think that is the strongest, because it's a lot of the libertarians who jumped on it originally. And of course, as more people come on and they learn about it and they learn about some of the issues, they understand it. But all of this discussion about, oh, well, maybe this digital currency is better. Well, okay, maybe it performs better, but you're not really understanding the issues here, because there are people who understand the technology very well, but they don't understand the economics, or they understand the economics very well and they don't understand the technology, which is why they think that it could be possibly something else. And, because it's such a complex subject, expressing it and talking about it and telling people about it in a way that they know that really affects their lives in a tangible way, in order to motivate them to get interested and get involved, is a really tricky thing to do, but it's going to be something that affects everybody. But engaging them in that conversation is really, really tricky.
So wait, what is this book that you wrote? Because I want you to plug it. I mean, you've been such a great guest. Thank you so much for coming on the show with us and sharing your perspective. I think it's really insightful. And you've clearly taken a lot of things into consideration that are valuable. And I don't know, this is great. But what's the book? Tell people about it.
So the book is called Truth Decay: How Bitcoin Fixes This. And it's not a long book. It's only about 35,000 words, but it's split into 3 parts. So the first part is my journey of how I became a dentist and how I learned about money, the basics of how Bitcoin was invented, and why I started to realize how important it was going forward. The middle part of the book is about how I accepted Bitcoin as a payment method in my business and the things to think about with that, because I think what a lot of people don't realize when they're encouraging businesses to accept Bitcoin as a payment method, actually accepting the Bitcoin is really easy. The problem is behind the scenes, which is the legal, the accounting, managing all of that back end stuff when you're taking on a different kind of currency. So the middle part of the book addresses some of those things. It also talks about, welfare system, the fact that if we're going into pure free market capitalism, we're going to have to find other ways of thinking about how we manage a health welfare system in the future, and we really need to start thinking about that. If we can use our imaginations as to what a world would be like based on a Bitcoin standard, how are these welfare systems going to operate in that? I think it's really important we start talking about it and thinking about it. And then the third part of the book is about what could happen in the future. It talks about the dysfunctional systems like the NHS, talks about game theory, the way in which by having all of our data on a centralized network could potentially be leading us into a trap. And again, just starting this discussion so people understand, this is the way it's going, but we have a choice here, and which choice is it that you're going to make? So that's the essence of the book. I've got a website, satoshishpage.com or howbitcoinfixesthis.com, where you can sign up for a newsletter. The book's going to launch in March. So the idea is I'm just kind of generating interest now, and then coming up to launch, I'll be sending out chapters just to get my early audience familiar with it. And then when it launches, if they're able to give me a review, that will give me a really great head start in terms of promoting it, because apart from anything else, I think it's really important that people have the information.
Wow. Well, you've definitely tapped my interest. A little bit of anarcho-capitalism in there, a little bit of health, and a little bit of ideas, a little bit of history on Bitcoin. Wow, what a great book. I'm really looking forward to it.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We'll have links to Victoria's information in the show notes. Everybody, thank you so much for listening to the TatianaShow.com. That's where you can listen to our show. We're, of course, on our main network, Let's Talk Bitcoin. We're also distributed to a bunch of others, so please check them out. We're online. Go to Queen Tatiana for Twitter. And Josh, I thought you had something. Oh, and by the way, I wanted to say a special thank you to our sponsor, eToro. So go and check them out. Their link is in the show notes as well. Josh, you had to say goodbye in some sort of special way?
No, no special way. I just wanted to let people know that the new front end of Voltoro is up there. If you want to trade with Bitcoin and gold instead of Bitcoin and filthy fiat, you can come onto Voltoro and check out the new blog and the new front side of everything before you go and log into the exchange. So I'm really happy with how that's turned out. It's great. And so, give us any feedback on Twitter. Jay Shigala is my username.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time on The Tatiana Show. Hey there, it's time for the show, The Tatiana Show, where you make friends and talk life and crypto. We gotta think and reflect and use lots of intellect with our hearts when we work together. I know that it can be so hard out there, looking all around and saying that life ain't fair. So that is why we will fight and stay up late at night, listening to the Tatiana Show. The Tatiana Show has been brought to you by CryptoMediaHub.com, a boutique marketing and PR agency for Bitcoin and beyond. Thank you for listening to The Tatiana Show. Please follow us on Twitter at Queen Tatiana or on Facebook and Instagram at Tatiana Moroz Music. More episodes can be found at thetatianashow.com, and make sure you leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends. You are listening to The Tatiana Show. This show may contain adult content, language, and humor and is intended for mature audiences. If that's not you, please stop listening. Nothing you hear on The Tatiana Show is intended as financial advice, legal advice, or really anything other than entertainment. Take everything you hear with a grain of salt. Oh, and if you're listening to us on an affiliate network, the ideas and views expressed on this show are not necessarily those of the network that you're listening on or of any sponsors or any affiliate products you may hear about on this show. Now that that's squared away, let's start the show.